It's never too early to get into the Halloween spirit. Hello everyone, Sober Oni of G&A Reviews here with a servant spotlight for the not-so-sober magical girl Oni, caster Shuten. We'll be examining her stats and skills, as well as going over pointers on how to utilize her effectively and an overall grade, comparing her to how she stacks up to the other 4-star servants. Now, onto Shuten's stats. Shuten has a max HP of 11,025 and a max attack of 9,538, which becomes 8,584 due to her assassin class damage modifier. For a 4-star caster, Shuten's HP is awful, ranking at the very bottom. However, to make up for this, she does pack the highest attack stat in her class. Compared to all the other 4-star servants overall, Shuten's HP is still fairly low, while her attack is just about average. Stat-wise, Shuten is built with a very heavy offensive focus, with a very glass cannon-like playstyle. Taking a look at her skills, her first skill is Heartbreak, rank A+. It inflicts NP seal on an enemy for 1 turn, and also decreases their crit rate for 3 turns between 30 and 50%, depending on level. Her second skill is Break Rod, rank B. It increases her Arts and Buster card effectiveness for 1 turn between 20 and 30%, and it also increases her Crit Star gather rate for 1 turn between 300 and 500%, all depending on level. And finally, her last skill is Demonic Nature of Oni, Guard, rank A. This increases the attack of all allies for 3 turns between 10 to 20%, and it also applies a special bonus damage against demonic enemies to herself for 3 turns between 30 and 50%, both depending on level. For her passives, Shuten has Territory Creation rank B, which increases her Arts card effectiveness by 8%, Item Construction rank B, which increases her debuff success rate by 8%, and Divinity rank C, which applies damage plus 150 to all of her attacks. Moving on to her deck and Noble Phantasm, Shuten has an Arts deck with Quick Arts Buster, and a Buster Noble Phantasm. Her Noble Phantasm Goho Shoujo Kuzuryu Osatsu applies Sure Hit for 1 turn, and deals significant damage to a single enemy with between a 600 and 1000% damage modifier, depending on level, and it also inflicts poison for 5 turns, dealing between 1000 and 5000 damage per turn, depending on overcharge. Taking a closer look at her deck, we see that her Quick card hits 4 times, her Arts hits 4 times, her Buster hits twice, and her extra attack hits 5 times. She has an NP gain rate of 0.46% and a star rate of 11%. Shuten does have some strong NP gain due to having very high hit counts on her Arts cards and also having 3 in her deck, but she does suffer from poor star generating from just 1 Quick card. As a welfare servant, caster Shuten has very simplistic and easy Ascension material requirements, only requiring 4 copies of the event-specific Magic Stick, which you get by completing the Halloween event. However, as an Oni, Shuten is just too devilish to make leveling her that easy, so her skill mat requirements are where the real hell begins. For her skills, Shuten will need 36 bones, 30 stingers, 16 phoenix plumes, and 20 aurora steels per skill. Bones can be farmed at XC in Fuyuki if you want to be AP efficient, or at the XG location in Fuyuki if you want the highest drop rate of 64%. Stingers are best farmed in the Field of Reeds in Babylonia, where they have a 62% drop rate, Phoenix Plumes have a 35% drop rate at the Town Hall in Salem, and Aurora Steel can be farmed in the Castle of Ice and Snow in Lost Belt 2 with a 39% drop rate. Shuten's transition to the caster class brings with it a whole new playstyle for her. Rather than a debuff-focused farmer, this Shuten seems to have a much more offensive focus. So how well does an offensive Shuten work? Well, unfortunately, on paper, her stats are not quite as thick as her thighs, with her low HP and average attack. But it's also important to keep in mind that while Shuten's attack is unremarkable compared to most other offensive 4-stars, it is remarkably high for a caster. Shuten also has another major advantage in her stat line in the form of her NP gain. Her heavy Arts deck, high hit counts, and high ranking territory creation means that she can build up NP charge very quickly, enabling her to be a bit of an NP spammer. And that's fortunate for her because Shuten's kit is built heavily around her ability to Noble Phantasm. Shuten has a major damage steroid in her second skill, Break Rod, which buffs both her arts and buster cards by 30% and gives her a 500% star weight buff for a turn. This skill is built solely to facilitate high burst damage turns with Shuten. The buster buff may not seem like much at only 30%, but it does work in conjunction with another buff to give Shuten's Noble Phantasm some good damage. Furthermore, the arts buff and star weight buff serve to make Shuten's follow-up attacks quite powerful, since they can crit very easily. Not only that, but because of the buff to her NP gain from the arts cards, Shuten can get a ton of NP charge and potentially even fill her gauge back up to full if she crits. That means that Noble Phantasm Arts Chains with caster Shuten can be ridiculously powerful. On the downside, this skill does only have one turn of uptime and a rather big 6-turn cooldown at max rank. But thankfully, Shuten does possess a high uptime damage buff in her third skill, Demonic Nature of Oni. This skill is a basic charisma, granting the party a 20% attack buff, but it additionally increases damage against demonic enemies massively. The attack buff is good. You should never underestimate the power of charisma. It gives the party an overall bump in DPS for the majority of the battle. So it's highly consistent, and as I mentioned earlier, it does stack well with Break Rod to really juice up her Noble Phantasm. The demonic damage, on the other hand, is highly situational, but it is still very useful as there are many demonic enemies. It is one of the largest trait categories for basic enemies. And many of the demonic enemies are assassins, like the Ghosts and Soul Eaters, so anti-demonic is an especially good skill for a caster to have. Unfortunately though, not many enemy servants have the demonic trait, so it's not the most useful buff for boss fights. That being said though, Shuten does have a very useful skill for boss fights in Heartbreak. This skill is an NP seal that also decreases an enemy's crit rate by 50%, and this skill is deceptively good. NP seal is one of the best debuffs to bring into a tough fight because it can potentially buy your whole team an extra turn. But the crit rate debuff shouldn't be overlooked either because assassin enemies tend to crit frequently, and a 50% debuff is massive. It also lasts for 3 turns, so when it's paired with other debuffs and stall strategies, this skill can seriously cripple an enemy's DPS. For skill order, I recommend leveling Break Rod first because that is Shuten's best damage skill, followed by Charisma for even more consistent damage, and then Heartbreak last as that is more niche. Shuten's Noble Phantasm is a single target buster nuke that applies sure hit and poisons the enemy. For as interesting and synergistic as her skill set is, Shuten's Noble Phantasm is very simple. It's just a big attack that deals a lot of damage. The sure hit is nice, especially since evade is a common skill for some assassins to have, but the poison is largely irrelevant. But simple doesn't mean bad, and in fact, this Noble Phantasm is what makes Shuten such a threat. This Noble Phantasm does damage. A lot of damage. When buffed with Break Rod and Charisma, Shuten actually has the 3rd strongest Noble Phantasm among all casters in the game, only being beaten out by Sanzo and Ilya, aka the 5-star casters. And when you take into account that Shuten is a free NP5 servant, it means that she will even overpower the 5-star casters unless you have them at NP2 or 3. Simply put, her NP damage compared to the other 4-star casters is in a league of its own. And this is Shuten's greatest strength. She can one-shot a lot of powerful assassin enemies with proper setup. And even if one Noble Phantasm isn't enough, her NP gain is so good that she can get off another 2 or 3 NPs if necessary. Her anti-demonic damage also makes her one of the best damage choices to bring against demonic enemies, which are pretty common. Combine all of that with some strong utility in Heartbreak, and Shuten can be considered one of the best damage dealing casters in the game. But for as good as her damage is, Shuten does have 2 major flaws. Firstly, she has no defensive skills, and to make matters worse, she has very low max HP. So longer fights can be difficult for her due to her frailty. With no protection, it's easy for some late game bosses to rip her apart in a single turn. But even worse than her lack of defense are her insane cooldowns. Both Break Rod and Heartbreak have a 6-turn cooldown and 1-turn effects, so they have extremely high downtime. This is especially bad for Break Rod because Shuten relies on that skill for for most of her NP damage, which means that even though Shuten could potentially NP spam, every Noble Phantasm after her first is going to be significantly weaker. Caster Shuten is a very burst or bust servant. While her burst damage is strong enough to even compare with the 5-star casters, once she unleashes her NP, her DPS and power fall off hard. There are a couple of ways to counteract these weaknesses depending on your team comp. Shuten needs to be paired with allies who can supplement her damage with extra buffs while her Break Rod is on cooldown. That way her damage doesn't fall off as hard. So pair her with servants who can give her strong, high uptime damage and card buffs like Helena, Liz, and Shakespeare. Helena and Shakespeare can both charge Shuten's Noble Phantasm gauge and buff her NP, so they're perfect if you want Shuten to get off 2 back-to-back NPs without losing out on any damage. Liz doesn't give any NP charge, but her defense down combined with her double charisma buff will dramatically bolster Shuten's damage. Other than building for damage, you should also have a defensive support available to keep Shuten alive. Servants who can heal, stall, or provide hard defense are perfect, like Tamamo, Leonidas, and Jean. Jean is of course the best at keeping frail servants alive thanks to her invincibility, debuff, clear, and heal. Tamamo helps out with stalling an enemy's Noble Phantasm while also providing healing and reducing Shuten's long cooldowns. And Leonidas can be a strong budget choice since he can taunt for days to keep Shuten safe while also buffing her NP damage, and Shuten can even prevent Leonidas from getting crit. Shuten's Bondcraft Essence is End of Dharmapala. It buffs the party's Buster card effectiveness and NP gain by 10%. A decent craft essence, but not usually worth running because it doesn't maximize Shuten's damage. Instead, you should use craft essences that can bolster your NP damage as much as possible, like Heaven's Feel, Black Grail, Aerial Drive, and Golden Wings, all of which help with 1-turn burst damage. If you're bringing Shuten to a longer fight and you want to keep her damage as consistent as possible, then use craft essences that buff arts and buster damage like Sweet Days, Sailor in White, Afternoon in the Citadel, and Welcome to Oniland. In the future, you should keep an eye out for Beautiful Dreamer, which increases NP gain, Buster card effectiveness, and grants starting NP charge. As for command codes, Gakyo no Ofude is worth considering on one of her arts cards because it buffs arts crit damage by 20%, so it has very good synergy with her Break Rod skill. Overall, Caster Shuten is a highly capable offensive caster. Her burst damage is leagues above most of the other casters while she's fully buffed. Her strong anti-demonic skill synergizes well with her class. She can be an NP spammer in the right team, and she even has some good utility in boss fights thanks to her NP seal and crit down. However, her low HP and complete lack of defensive skills make it hard to keep her alive in most battles, and her long cooldowns cause her damage to fall off considerably after her initial NP, which makes her a poor option for sustained damage in longer fights. So all in all, she gets a B+ from me. In the right situations, Shuten can be a menace and an absolute powerhouse compared to most of the other offensive casters. But her low defense and her inability to keep her damage numbers high puts her at a big disadvantage in most fights during the break bar era, unless she has some powerful supports buffing her. And those are my thoughts on Caster Shuten. If you need an offensive caster, she will be invaluable to you. Plus, it's Shuten, and who doesn't love Shuten? But what do you think about the upcoming Halloween welfare? Let me know in the comments down below, and if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like and consider subscribing if you really enjoyed the video. Join the party over our Discord, chill with us on Twitch, and follow us on Twitter. Now see you all in the next Servant Spotlight. Sobroni out. Later.